Hey internets, here's a fun thought experiment. Let's say that aliens from outer space have invaded Earth and have fired an extra super death ray from their mothership that hits our entire planet. This ray of doom will last for 24 hours, and the aliens have telepathically communicated to all of us the knowledge that at the end of the time frame, it will kill every single human who at one point during the death ray did the Macarena while wearing a pacifier. Everyone who does not do the Macarena dance in a pacifier in this specific fashion will face absolutely no consequences whatsoever, and that's all the death ray does. Yep, that's it. It only kills people who specifically do the Macarena while wearing a pacifier. The death ray does absolutely nothing else, and it will do absolutely nothing to you so long as you don't do that dance. And the question is, do you do the dance? Now, of course, immediately, if you're a rational human being, your answer is probably, of course freaking not. Why in the hell would anyone make a fool out of themselves in such a very oddly specific way if doing so would lead to your death? It's completely ridiculous. All we all have to do is just ignore the death ray and nothing happens. But of course, there's a catch. That's only half the story. You see, the aliens then telepathically inform us with some additional knowledge, which is that if at least 50% of humanity does the Macarena while wearing a pacifier, then nobody will die. That's right, so now the stakes have been raised. This means you can potentially save the lives of everyone who does the pacifier Macarena dance by putting your own life on the line and doing it with them, so long as, again, at least half the population also does it, and if they don't, then everyone who did the Macarena while wearing a pacifier dies. So how about now? Do you join in the Macarena pacifier nonsense? Well, me personally, no. No, I would not. And yet, the interesting thing here is that there is a thought experiment currently going around on the internet, which would imply that you are a terrible person if you don't do so. Because I mean, hey, don't you know that it's easier to get 50% of people to do something than 100% of people? So clearly, you need to grab that pacifier, stick it in your mouth, and get to it to show the world what a good little altruistic sap you are. This all may sound absurd, but as some of you who are already keyed into the current online discussion I am alluding to here, what I just gave is an example of the red button, blue button paradox, where two buttons are presented to you. If you press the red button, nothing happens. But if you press the blue button, you will die. Unless, of course, at least 50% of the people who are presented with this question also choose to press the blue button, in which case, nobody dies. It's a thought experiment to test the limits of altruism. Should you put your life on the line for the sake of some people who may make a really bad decision? And so in this video, I'm going to point out what just about everybody is getting wrong with this experiment. But first off, to help fund this video, and also because I think it would be hilarious, I'm going to be temporarily putting the red and blue Fumo hats on my merch store on sale. Yep, that's right, you can also show which button you'd want to press by buying one of my hats, while also supporting me in my endeavor to continue making content like this. And they are actually pretty darn good quality hats. The eyes on them are embroidered the same way a real Fumo is. So a link to that will be in the description below, or you can use this QR code. But anyway, back on topic. The red button versus blue button question. Let me take you back a bit and just give you the basic history of what's really going on here. Because technically, questions like these have actually been getting asked since the dawn of human civilization, far predating the internet, going all the way back to philosophers like Aristotle, and the question of whether or not it's worth it to take a personal risk for greater collective flourishing. And it's a thing people have struggled with throughout the ages. Do you take a personal risk in the action of trusting others, not knowing whether or not they will betray you? And so what we're seeing now on the internet is just another incarnation of this. On X from Tim Urban, and the question is this: everyone in the world has to take a private vote by pressing a red or blue button. If more than 50% of the people press the blue button, everyone survives. If less than 50% of people press the blue button, only people who press the red button survive. Which button would you press? And then, of course, Mr. Beast has to step in and be an absolute mad lad and repost the question for an additional 41 million views. Hence why the internet has been completely losing their minds over this over the past 2 weeks, with hundreds of thousands of people giving their little take on why the red button is the correct choice or why the blue button is the correct choice. And some of those reasons are good, but a lot of them kind of aren't. And a lot of people are also misunderstanding this question to mean something that it really doesn't mean. And of course, just about everybody missed the real problem with it, which I will get into towards the end of this video. For now, I'd just like to point out the most common problem, and we can go from there. And this first issue is people blaming the other side. Red buttoners blaming blue buttoners, and blue buttoners blaming red buttoners. The basic arguments go like this. From the red buttoner side, this just comes down to pointing out the fact that nobody actually has to press the blue button. If 100% of people just press the red button, then, well, nothing happens. It's as if the game never occurred. And therefore, people only die if people press blue. And thus, blue button pressers are dumb. The basic argument is that they just don't understand game theory, and they're making a much ado about nothing. Or in other words, the question can be simplified as blue button might die, red button definitely won't die. And so it's not just from an individualist standpoint of saving your own skin that you'd want to press the red button, but it's also important to point out that anybody who presses the blue button would ultimately be at fault for pressing the blue button. And then from the blue button side, it's basically just them saying that anybody who would press the red button is evil, because they don't care about others. You see, the basic argument from the blue button side is, yes, okay, it's true that if 100% of people press the red button, then everyone lives. But the thing is, that's also a completely unrealistic way to look at it. Because one unfortunate thing about humanity is that no matter how obvious it is what the correct path should be, everyone will not just. When people are given a question, this simple binary question between two options, there's going to be a sizable chunk of the population, usually at least 10% or so, who is just going to kind of press the buttons at random. And even a higher percentage really just won't even understand the question entirely. And of course, in this case, a lot of people will press the blue button because they think it's the nicer option. It has that kind of altruistic bend to it, whereby pressing the blue button, you are putting your own life on the line in order to rescue the people who accidentally pressed the wrong button. Thus, interestingly enough, making the blue button a little bit more popular. As I said earlier, it is true that it is easier to get 50% of the population to do something rather than getting 100% of the population to do something. And so while it's true the blue button is the might die button, it is also to some degree the nobody has to die button as well, which is part of why many call this thought experiment a bit of a paradox. Because technically people are only being put in danger by the fact that they are pressing the blue button. But you can also argue that pressing the blue button makes sense to save them. But then that also just adds more people to the pile of the blue button pressers who are effectively risking their own demise for basically no reason, because again, the red buttoners are correct that technically if you press the red button, nothing happens to you and everybody could just press that button. And so thus a lot of people are arguing that the blue button is the right thing to do and pressing the red button is thus the murder button, because you are trying to murder the portion of the population that just presses the wrong button, which then paradoxically makes it seem like the correct button in their eyes. And what's interesting here is that both sides are actually kind of wrong. It is not the red buttoner's fault. The red button is not the murder button. And likewise, saying that the blue button is the stupid button is a bit of an oversimplification. Yes, technically it is also kind of the stupid button, but it's also the save everybody who fell down the pit button. And that's the basic argument that the blue team will give, that the red button isn't actually a nothing happens button. Rather, the red button is actually saying that you're okay with some people dying so long as you save your own skin. Because a significant portion of the population all dying absolutely is something happening. For example, say red won 70% to 30%. 30% of the population of Earth dying would be an absolute economic catastrophe, especially in first world countries where I would imagine that most people would actually be more likely to press blue. Many first world countries are already facing a birth rate crisis, and so random death, especially since a lot of the people who would press the blue button would be kids again, would definitely not be a good thing. Which means even from an individualist standpoint, there actually is some risk tied to the red button from a purely consequentialist perspective. And then of course there's the issue of whether or not someone you care about might press the blue button. Simply imagine someone you love dying as a result of this, and the logic behind the blue button becomes obvious. For example, if it was just between you and your family, you probably know that the children in your family might easily accidentally press the blue button, and of course there's your aunt who will think that it's the nice button, so even if you would originally obviously want to choose the red button, there are arguments that can be made under a very high trust scenario, such as again within your family, to press the blue button. But that still doesn't mean that the red buttoners are at fault either. Neither party is at fault. And the reason why comes down to one simple word: consent. Because one question that a few people ask but wasn't really fully explored in this thought experiment is, what if you just don't press any of the buttons? Which then just brings a lot of people going, oh no, you can't do that. You gotta press one of the buttons. Okay, well, why? Why do you have to press the button? Why do the red buttoners need to press the red button for nothing to happen? Shouldn't walking away and refusing to play the game also mean that nothing happens? Because the thing is, if you can walk away from this scenario and refuse to press any of the buttons, then that automatically just becomes the actual obviously correct choice. If you are actually presented with this game and you had the option to just refuse to play the game, then yes, you could technically argue that the red button is the murder button, because you could alternatively just choose to not play, and thus you're not adding anything to the red button hat that would make it harder for the blue buttoners to reach 50%. And the same thing is true for the blue buttoners. The only reason to play the game is if you suspect that some people decided to play and press the red button for the hell of it. But ultimately, the smart choice would be to just not play the game. And if you don't have that choice, then the real person who is at fault for all of the deaths in case blue doesn't reach 50% is not the red buttoners or or really the blue buttoners? It's the person forcing you to play this game. Because of course, realistically, if this were to actually happen in real life, it probably would be some weird kind of test from an alien race that have come to exterminate Earth or something, but have decided to first force us to play this kind of sick, twisted game that they just came up with. Which means the fault for all of these deaths, in the event that the blue buttoners lost it, well, that fault would actually lie on the aliens, not the red button pressers. Because if you don't have the option to consent to playing this death game, then the aggressors who are causing the deaths are in fact the people who are taking away that ability to consent. And this is why I'm personally a bit more on the red button side. You can never say that somebody is required to put their life on the line for somebody else if they are not the one who caused them to be in a predicament where their life is in danger in the first place. For example, if you witness a thief stealing a girl's purse or something like that, sure, you can argue that it is noble to save that woman from the thief, but you cannot say that it's your fault that she's getting stolen from. The fault is very much on the thief. And thus the question of whether or not to step in and help her must entirely be one's own choice. To say that someone is required to do that is actually where you kind of run into the problem of altruism, which a lot of people misunderstand as being the same thing as goodwill. Goodwill is saying that it is good to help others if you can by your own will, whereas altruism is more of saying that you have to help others or else you are bad. The difference is entitlement, and this has wide-ranging consequences when you shape society around this misunderstanding, because altruism is where you get problems between the welfare state and private charity. Private charity is goodwill because people can consent to it or not. But under the welfare state, everybody is being forced to participate in the welfare scheme. You don't have an option to opt out of those taxes going to these programs. And thus altruism is actually just a form of slavery that has been reworded to make it sound like goodwill, when in reality it is just communist nonsense that actually prevents true goodwill from existing. Another bad argument that I see is coming up a lot, this one particularly just comes from the blue button side, is people pointing out, hey, look, the blue buttoners won the vote, therefore the blue button is the correct choice. Now, aside from that just being kind of a silly bandwagon fallacy at absolute best, it's also ignoring kind of the obvious issue of stated preference versus revealed preference. Because of course, in the thought experiment as people are voting on X, the thing is, it's just a thought experiment. It's not actually happening. Obviously, nobody's life was actually on the line here in Mr. Beast's little game. Or at least we hope that he didn't have a way of doing that. I mean, for who knows, knowing Mr. Beast, maybe he had some kind of secret biolab and he was actually planning to do it. Probably not. Very low chance. I mean, less than 1% chance. But you can't exactly say that it's zero. But of course, I'm joking here. As far as everybody knew, this wasn't actually a real thing that was actually happening. And so thus the vote is not whether or not people would actually press the red button or actually press the blue button, but rather the vote is more about what people are willing to say that they would do, or at least tell themselves that they would do. Because of course, it's disconnected from any kind of real consequence. Which means that this really is susceptible to the psychological phenomenon where there's a difference between what people say they would do and what they will actually do once consequences actually do manifest. This is most obviously shown in the dating scene, because it's easy to say that you want a nice partner, but a lot of times when given the choice between the nice guy or the tall and wealthy guy on actual dating apps as shown through their revealed preferences, a lot of them just tend to go for the wealth instead. And so there's a disconnect between what it feels good to say and what one will actually do when in a situation where there's actual consequences for their actions. But then that just brings us to the question, okay, well, how do we know that it's revealed preference? And there's a pretty good reason to suspect that that's the case when it comes to the red-blue button question. And the reason why is because when faced with an actual specific scenario outside of just a very simple red or blue button, the red button almost always ends up winning, actually. So for example, one person asks, okay, there's a wood chipper, and you can either choose to jump into it or choose not to jump into the wood chipper. But the wood chipper has a fault. A design flaw where if more than 50% of humanity jumps in, then the wood chipper will break and everyone will survive. But if less than 50% of the population does it, then everybody in the wood chipper dies. What would you do? Would you jump into the wood chipper? And then all of a sudden people start selecting that no, they wouldn't jump into the wood chipper, even though this is effectively the same question as the red button, blue button question. Or another one was from this guy. A train is coming down a track. Everyone on Earth has the choice to either tie themselves to the track or to not tie themselves to the track. If more than 50% of the people choose to tie themselves down to the train track as the train is coming, then the train will turn around and won't run anybody over. Do you tie yourself to the track or not? And everyone chooses no. Or here's one that really puts it down. Everyone on Earth is given an opportunity to ingest a cyanide pill. The only way to get the antidote is if more than 50% of people choose to ingest the cyanide pill. Do you ingest the cyanide pill, or do you not? And people overwhelmingly vote no. You see, there's something about a red button and a blue button in just kind of a room with you and nothing else that psychologically disconnects people from the reality of their own death. And so then you ask them to imagine a scenario that is effectively the exact same question, but reworded in a way to actually imagine yourself doing the thing that causes your death in a more specific fashion, like say ingesting a cyanide pill. Then all of a sudden people actually think about it a bit more and realize what it is they're actually doing. And then the blue buttoners lose. But again, it's all just an online poll with no real consequences. The truth is, we don't actually really know what the real numbers would be. Or as this post points out, the problem with the blue button: don't make me tap the sign. An online poll with no actual risk obviously doesn't represent how people would behave in a real life or death situation. It's very, very easy to say that you will be the altruistic hero, to say that you would put your life in harm's way. But there's a very big difference between actually doing that and just virtue signaling on the internet. And so there's a very big difference between telling others, or really just even trying to tell yourself, that you would totally jump into raging waters during a flash flood to save a puppy. But there's a very big difference between saying that and actually doing that when push comes to shove. Or in other words, it's much easier to imagine oneself as the hero than it is to actually be a hero. And then another similar problem is just the question of public trust and who you're playing this game with. As I mentioned earlier, there is one scenario where I personally would probably favor the blue button over the red button, and that's when I'm playing the game, but only with a pool of people that make up my own family. See, and then in that case, it does make sense, and it's not just because they're family, but because I know my family. Many of them are left-leaning liberals, actually. I'm actually kind of the weirdo out here being a right-wing libertarian. I know that most of them actually probably would go for the blue button, and plus I don't really want to see any of the kids die. And so I might as well press it, having that knowledge, because I know it's not that big of a risk. But again, it's because I know them. But what if you don't really know who you're playing against? For example, I did see a lot of people on the more authoritarian right saying that they would press the blue button because it's correct for society, yada yada yada. I have a very simple question for all of them. Would you still press the blue button if the population you were playing this death game with was Somalia? Now, Somalia, of course, is well known as being an extremely low trust society, but more than that, it's also a very low IQ society and a very uneducated society. It is a country that is well known as being full of people who are willing to murder you for just a simple dollar. That's a harsh way of putting it, but that's reality. It's regularly ranked as one of the worst countries to live in. If you had to play the ultimate death gamble against Somalia, then the correct answer would obviously be to smash that red button as fast as you possibly can. And I almost guarantee that anybody who argued for the blue button would also smash that red button pretty quick if they were playing against Somalia as well. Because in this specific scenario, the red button is almost guaranteed to win. The blue button effectively becomes a suicide button. But then that brings us to another question. If the red button would almost certainly win in a terrible country, then doesn't that mean that in a global playing of the red button, blue button game, that the people left over in a red button society would mostly be comprised of worse people? Because the issue here is that it's a bit of a midwit meme, but it's a midwit meme slightly more towards the blue buttoners' favor. There are very high IQ reasons to press the red button, with the big one being, as I mentioned earlier, the very obvious difference between revealed and stated preference. I personally would be a red button pusher simply because I understand that difference, and I understand that red would almost certainly win if this was a real thing. I mean, the fact that it's even close at all in an online poll with no real consequences should kind of be a dead giveaway if this was an actual real thing. I can say with pretty high level of confidence that the blue button is almost certainly a suicide button. But at the same time, I can understand the final argument for the blue buttoners, which is just that they don't want to live in a world with people who mostly press the red button. Because sure, you're going to have some high IQ people on the red button pressers. For example, well-read academic libertarians, and those of us who actually understand game theory, and also those of us who understand that the red button is absolutely winning in a real scenario, let's be honest here. But then of course there's also the low-trust third-worlders who would all press the red button without really thinking about it any further than their own life. They wouldn't even consider any of the philosophy I've gone over in this video at all. They just press the red button. While meanwhile you have a lot of people mistakenly pressing the blue button, but then also a lot of very well-meaning people pressing the blue button. And ultimately the world would probably be a worse place. And this is where we get to the thing that just about everybody missed. The big reveal that I teased at the beginning of the video. And ultimately it has to do with knowledge. You see, the problem here, as some people have pointed out, is that this is really just effectively the prisoner's dilemma, where it is logical to actually choose the illogical choice, not because it's logical, but simply because you don't know what the other prisoner is going to choose. But then in the hypothetical scenario where where you do know, where you do have some kind of magical omniscient powers, where you know what other people are going to choose, then all of a sudden there's a very obvious correct answer to the red blue button question. For example, if we go back to the scenario where it's aliens that are forcing us to all choose between the red and blue button, and it just turns out that you are the last person on the planet to step into the red and blue button booth, and the aliens telepathically inform you that 80% of the population has pressed the red button, which button are you going to pick? Well, I mean, if you know that you're the last person, and that 80% of the population has already chosen to press the red button, then well, obviously the correct choice is to just press the red button. There's no point in just dying for nothing. Your vote isn't going to have any change on the outcome. You know that the red button has already won, and so you might as well just save yourself at that point. And then of course you can imagine the same thing being true in the blue button scenario. If again, you are the last person to enter the booth and the aliens telepathically inform you that you are the last person in the booth, and that you are also the tie-breaking vote, well then obviously the correct button to press would be the blue button, because you know you're not going to die, because you are the tie-breaking vote, and so you might as well just choose to save 50% of humanity. There's no downside there. But this is all simply because, again, you have been given omniscient powers in this hypothetical scenario. But the thing is, it's actually a bit more than that, because if we disconnect this from the context and look at it more from the standpoint of epistemology, one issue with knowledge and what we know is true is that we humans are not psychic. And so you don't actually know what other people want. So when faced with choices for other people, how could you possibly know what correct knowledge could be when you are not them? Wow, gee, it's almost as if this entire scenario is accidentally just proof, once again, that democracy kinda sucks. Yep, that's right, that is the thing that everybody missed. What this entire thought experiment actually does is it's just one more piece of proof that democracy is a very flawed system. And one of the big issues with democracy is that it is just a soft version of socialism, and because it is a soft version of socialism, it's actually susceptible to some of the same flaws as socialism, and this just so happens to be one of them. Much like the knowledge problem haunts socialist economic policy in general, it also haunts democracy. And so just like people were repackaging the red-blue question in things like a meat grinder or a suicide pill that magically generates the antidote and enough people take the pill, you can also very well reword this thought experiment in the context of democracy. For example, the very common framework of voting between two politicians for some high office. We can just say that it's for president or for prime minister or whatever, but really it could be any position in any office, just some kind of leadership position, could even be mayor, whatever, doesn't matter. Now in this scenario, one of the politicians promises to basically do almost nothing and reduce the size and scope of the government, whereas the alternative politician, the other guy, promises that doomsday will occur unless we implement new socialist policies where we import infinity Somalians and put them on infinity welfare. No need for them to work or anything like that. They just come here and they get free stuff, all on net taxpayer dime. And if we don't do it, then we are perpetuating imperialism or colonialism or something. And so we just gotta do it, because we just do. Doomsday will occur. Late stage capitalism. And of course, at first, this might not seem like it's a scenario that exactly fits the bill, because at least on the surface, it's not quite the same thing as, say, a more direct comparison or a direct hypothetical, like voting for a red pill or a blue pill or something, and everybody who votes to take the blue pill will die because they only get the antidote if they get 50% of the vote or more or something like that. It's not exactly the same thing here. We're just talking about economic policy. And I think that's what really tricks people, because yes, that's true, it may not seem like the same thing on the surface. The issue is it has kind of the same consequences and the same flaws and reasoning behind it, as well as the same, again, knowledge problem. Because let's say either United States or some countries in Europe decide to have a pact where they're just gonna do it. They're gonna import the entire population of Somalia, and then they're just gonna put them on, let's say, $5,000 of UBI paid for by the taxpayer each month or something like that. And the immediate question, just aside from the economic issues with doing that, of forcing people to pay for others, aside from just the suicidal empathy issue there, you also have to ask yourself, okay, what about the Somalians? What do they think? Do you even know how these people you're importing and giving infinity welfare to are going to think about this predicament? Are they going to be grateful to you for it? Or are they going to view you as complete clueless saps and take advantage of you for it? And so we quickly see the same silly risk that is involved with the blue button in this hypothetical policy. You don't actually know what other people are going to do, and so you don't actually know if this is going to pay off. And then of course there's the obvious question of who is responsible for the consequences if it doesn't pay off. Ultimately, it's going to be a lot of the people who voted against this policy, who did not vote to give infinity welfare to infinity people. But they're going to pay the consequences anyway, which actually in many ways makes democracy even worse in this scenario. Because at least in the red button, blue button hypothetical thought experiment, it's mostly just the blue buttoners who are suffering the consequences of their own silly choice. But under democracy, when it quote-unquote wins, everybody kind of gets forced to go along with the suicidal empathy as well. Which then immediately brings you to the question, okay, wouldn't a better immigration policy be just not having welfare for them? So that way the immigrants who come over are the ones who actually have something to offer. But instead we're stuck with a system where you can effectively vote for other people's resources to be spent in a certain way. But how do you know that that's the way that those resources really should be spent? And so then people say, oh well, it's the will of the people. That's the point of democracy. Democracy solves the knowledge problem by discovering the will of the people. But that's an issue, because the thing is, there is no will of the people. That is actually an example of something I went over recently, the collectivist fallacy. Quote unquote, the people are not a concretely real thing. Democracy can never reveal what quote unquote the people want, because quote unquote the people are in fact just billions of individuals who all want different things, and their preference does not change based on the outcome of the vote, at least assuming they are a player character and not an NPC. And so thus the act of voting is not to determine the will of the people, but rather it is an act where one claims that they know what others want better than they do, which is an absurdity, because obviously you don't actually know what other people want more than they know what they desire. Because of course there is no mind of quote unquote the people, because that's not a real concrete thing. It's an abstract concept we made up in order to make it easier to understand the large numbers of minds out there that exist. But that doesn't change the fact that only those minds are what actually exists. There is no collective mind, and thus democracy cannot determine what that collective mind is. But it tries to anyway, hence why we call democracy often a soft version of socialism. It's not as bad as direct communism, but it does still suffer from the collectivist fallacy. And another similar issue that it has to the red button, blue button scenario is of course stated and revealed preference as well. What people say they want on a ballot box doesn't necessarily reveal what they really think is the best idea, because much in the same way it disconnects people from any hint of responsibility. For instance, let's imagine a more simple scenario, one that's a little bit less destructive of a scenario. Let's say a mayor holds a vote for people on whether they want to build an opera house in the city or to build a new sports stadium. And the immediate issue you run into here is, are the people who are voting for this actually going to pay for either of them? Are the people who vote for a sports stadium actually going to pay for tickets to go see the game? And are the people who are going to vote for the opera house, are they actually going to pay for tickets? And so the mayor says, well, no matter, either one will be free admission. But of course, it's not actually free. It's just going to be paid for by the taxpayer in that instance. But then how do we actually know if those resources are being spent efficiently? Versus the alternative scenario where both are built using private investment and both charge ticket prices. And they survive or fail based on whether or not people are actually willing to spend their resources on them, aka revealed preference. And that's what a lot of people missed with this red button, blue button question. It's effectively just taking a vote on something and betting on whether or not other people are going to vote a certain way. And the entire reason it's a paradox in the first place comes down to the fact that we don't have magic knowledge and we don't actually know what people are going to do. We can make a guess based on the reasons I've just gone over in this video, but you don't actually know which one's best. You can definitely say that the red button is better as an individual, but in the long run, in the time preference world, which one's actually better does in fact depend on what other people are going to do either way. And at the root of the problem, the thing that people are just kind of missing is that we've kind of forgotten that altruism isn't really that great of a thing. It should not be something that you force people into doing. It is not the same thing as goodwill. And so it is not the red buttoners who are lay evil, and it's not even really the blue buttoners being lay stupid, but rather it is the very nature of forcing people into this kind of vote in the first place, and people not noticing that this is actually just proof that democracy isn't exactly what it's all cracked up to be. That is the true problem. Anyways, that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you have not already. And also, you can support my content on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or again, by buying some merch. And yes, the Fumo Blue and Fumo Red hats are on sale. You should just kind of forget the whole red button, blue button thing and buy whichever one you want. But for now, that is all. Thanks for watching. Till next time.